What's up, ballers and sneakerheads? Welcome to Basketball at the Bar. My name is Calvin. Today on our featured short, we are talking about the Los Angeles Lakers, more specifically a long list of Laker veterans who are now unsigned and still available more than a month into this offseason's free agency. We're talking about some big-time names here, potentially a few future Hall of Famers as well that are aging and perhaps diminishing. The question is, will they get another opportunity to suit it up for another franchise or a return perhaps to the Lakers for a run-it-back situation? Before we get any further, please remember, if you love this content, if you love basketball, like this video. Of course, subscribe to the channel Basketball at the Bar, and please share this content with other friends and family that are like-minded as you are. Thank you. It is much, much appreciated. Let's get into it here and start breaking down this list of Laker vets that are still available in free agency. All right, guys, so as all of you I'm sure know by now, last season was a complete failure from the Los Angeles Lakers' perspective, especially when you consider the fact that this team, which has a big three composed of Anthony Davis, LeBron James, and Russell Westbrook, were the odds-on favorites to win the Western Conference at the start of last season and failed to even make the playoffs. Now, of course, this is for a variety of reasons, a long list, albeit, of course, health being the number one reason. LeBron James and Anthony Davis combined to play in only 68 games last year. Russell Westbrook took a ton of blame from media and fans alike for his very disappointing season at point guard for the Lakers. And Frank Vogel, who is no longer the head coach, whether it's his fault or not, was unable to get the group as a whole to play the type of style necessary to keep the Lakers competitive despite all of the injuries. Now, last season, the Lakers were all in on veteran players, guys with a lot of experience, talented players, friends of LeBron James and Anthony Davis. They wanted to create a reimagining of the 90s Bulls, especially those late teams that had a starting lineup of all players well into their 30s, including a 35-year-old Michael Jordan. The Lakers didn't come close to repeating the type of success that the Dynasty Bulls team had back in the 90s, and they have apparently learned from their mistakes, completely flipping the script heading into the 2023 season. The Lakers have gotten rid of Frank Vogel. In is Darvin Ham, a young, fresh, energetic head coach, first-time head coach, the former Milwaukee Bucks assistant. They have also completely turned over the role players on this roster, clearly going with younger, fresher, more energetic guys. Out are some of these older veterans that we're going to talk about here. In are a new group of young, early to mid 20-year-olds, guys like Lonnie Walker IV from San Antonio, Thomas Bryant, Troy Brown Jr., Damian Jones of the Sacramento Kings last season, and Juan Toscano Anderson from the Golden State Warriors championship team have all been signed early on here in this offseason for the Lakers. What does that mean for some of these other guys who are now on the outside looking in? We're going to go to an article here on ESPN.com written by Bobby Marks, who, if you're unfamiliar with Bobby, he is a former NBA executive with the Brooklyn Nets, I should say, formerly the New Jersey Nets. And he's got a list here of 10 players, ex-Lakers, who are still looking for work this offseason. And as I mentioned before, some of these guys are household names. Of course, Carmelo Anthony and Dwight Howard headline this list here pictured on your screen. We're going to go through this list and just kind of talk about the chances any of these guys have of getting another job here this season. And I think you have to, of course, start with this list with the most prominent and the guy who had the best season for the Lakers out of all these players last year, and that's Carmelo Anthony, who, like LeBron James, would be entering his 20th NBA season. He and James became the first pair of veteran teammates to play on the same team in their 19th season last year. He got off to a very hot start, but cooled off as the Lakers suffered injury after injury and Anthony's role increased. He was asked to do a little bit more. His production, his numbers, his shooting efficiency all dropped as a result of that. Now the question is, where does Carmelo Anthony go from here? The Lakers could definitely still use him, I think. They definitely could use some more shooting. They lost Malik Monk, who had a career year for them last year off the bench. But they've made a very clear statement to going towards a younger supporting cast than they had last year. So that probably means he's out in LA, at least from the Lakers' perspective. As Bobby Marks details here in this article, the best fit for him might, in fact, be a return to New York. This is a theme that we're going to talk about, not necessarily the Knicks specifically, but with all of these players and what they're looking for in terms of a team signing them. These guys are kind of very dependent on what happens here with the rest of the free agent and the trade market, because all these teams in the league have pretty much filled their roster spots at this point. Training camp is right around the corner, and there are very few teams left that are scrambling to fill out their rosters. However, guys like Kevin Durant, Kyrie Irving, and Donovan Mitchell all still being available for trade definitely could cause some roster spots to open up on some of these teams that are locked in trying to acquire these guys. The New York Knicks are definitely one of them. They've been linked to both Kevin Durant and Donovan Mitchell now in the trade conversations for months. If they're able to pull off some sort of deal like that, they're probably going to have to send multiple players, multiple assets, multiple draft picks in return for Donovan Mitchell, Kevin Durant, and maybe one other player. And that's going to open up a couple of roster spots that they'll need to fill. So Carmelo could very well see a return to Madison Square Garden, which is where you can argue he had the best years of his career anyway. It's always going to be a reserve role, I would imagine, with any of these guys. Carmelo definitely, I think, has a chance to land on a roster. It's just going to depend on what a lot of these other teams do. And then some of these other guys that we'll get into here are probably going to be depending on maybe an early season injury from someone on a particular team, or, an invite to training camp, and hopefully they're able to make the roster that way. So that being said, let's take a look at the rest of this list here of these 10 players. Of course, we've got Anthony here. He averaged 13 points a game last season. He is 38 years old and entering what would be the 20th season of his career. After that, we've got Dwight Howard, who again is probably going to be the other most prominent player on this list. Dwight is 36 years old, and he's probably also depending on open roster spots filling up. There are certainly teams that could use him right now. Brooklyn would be one of them. The Clippers could use a little bit of size as well. However, both those teams are a little bit strapped right now. They don't necessarily have the open roster spots, or in the Clippers case, they're definitely going to be a tax team. So any additional pieces that they're able to add are only going to make that tax, luxury tax, all that stuff worse and worse, which means that the chances of Dwight Howard getting signed by said teams are probably fewer and fewer. So we've got Dwight Howard here. We also have Avery Bradley, who is the youngest player available out of all these ex-Lakers at just 31. I have to think Avery Bradley has a good chance of landing on a team at some point this season. Maybe it's not to start the year, but he is a very reliable two-way player, a guy that a contending team could certainly use down the stretch for both his outside shooting and his defense. We've also got Kent Bazemore here, who is 33 years old, has played for a long list of very, very well-run, winning franchises, the Golden State Warriors and the Lakers being a couple of them. DJ Augustine is another player, and these guys are all, again, not necessarily played the entire season with the Lakers, but they did play in LA at one point or another last year. DJ Augustine, 34 years old. Wayne Ellington is also 34 years old. This is another guy who, will probably have to rely on an injury of some kind or a desperation move for a team, but the fact that he is such a great shooter probably strengthens his case for being a guy that will be picked up or signed at some point during the year, because teams are always looking for shooting. The next guy on this list is probably the most polarizing and maybe the most interesting of all players on this ex-Laker list, and that's Rajon Rondo. Rondo's had an interesting last 9 months or so. He, of course, was allegedly involved in a domestic violence dispute, which the charges have been dismissed for that, but the league is still looking into it, and I'm sure every NBA team is following that saga as well. There could very well be a suspension that comes down for Rondo, so he's probably going to be one of those guys that definitely doesn't start the season on a team, but could be an emergency plug-and-play type guy for a contender. The Boston Celtics might be one of those teams. Maybe it's the Phoenix Suns. Even teams that are maybe not like in the top list, but he played for the Cleveland Cavaliers last year as a great role model and a guy who has a lot of learning experience available to a young guard like Darius Garland. So a team like that might be able to take a risk on him at some point. And even his former team in the Boston Celtics, they did just grab Malcolm Brogdon. He's got some injury issues in the past as well. They do have a couple of roster spots open still. So Rondo's one of those guys that I think is very intriguing to watch because he brings a lot of value, right, to any franchise that decides to sign him. However, he's also aging at 36 years old. He's coming off of an injury. He has the off-the-court issue right now. So it's going to be very interesting to watch what happens with him. As we continue down this list, we've got Trevor Ariza, who is 37. Ariza makes sense, I think, for a few teams. Bobby Marks here has the Miami Heat and the Golden State Warriors at the top of his best fit list. But as he points out here, those teams are still keeping roster spots open at the moment for guys like Udonis Haslem and Andre Iguodala, people who probably won't play a single minute during the regular season, but they're on the team for their experience, their veteran leadership. They're almost extensions of the coaching staff as players. So if one of those guys decides to retire, perhaps that opens up a spot for somebody like Ariza who could fill the wing position. We've also got Darren Collison on this list, a former Maui Invitational Tournament MVP. And then the final player is Isaiah Thomas, IT, 33 years old. Of course, he had a long road back to the NBA that's been well documented on social media after his terrible hip injury coming off a near MVP season in Boston. Finally was able to crack his way back into the league last year, playing for both the Lakers and the Charlotte Hornets, even played in the play-in tournament with Charlotte at the end of last year. Guys, I'm interested to know what your input is, what you think about these guys. Who is your favorite team? Would you be willing to take a risk on any of these guys, whether it's Carmelo Anthony or Isaiah Thomas or even Rajon Rondo? What are the chances you think that some of these guys will wind up playing next season at any point? Please let us know down in the comments below. If I had to take a guess here, there aren't many players on this list that I would expect to see play next season, at least right away. I'm not sure any of these guys are going to end up on a roster come training camp, but I'd have to say Avery Bradley, Carmelo Anthony, Dwight Howard are going to be my top three guys here in terms of the chances that they make an NBA roster at some point next season. I think that teams are going to get a little desperate. Of course, you've got to look, again, at all these contenders out there. All the teams, that you would put probably in the top 5 to 8 teams in the league, once it comes to the trade deadline, they're going to be trying to figure out ways where they can bolster that edge just a little bit more. Not to mention health, of course, plays a big role in all of this, as it played with the Lakers, giving a lot of these guys opportunities. I mean, people like Isaiah Thomas probably wouldn't have even played for the Lakers last year if it weren't for all the injuries that they went through. So it's a very, very interesting list here, especially when you think about the total number of accolades of all these players. Again, future Hall of Famers on this list for sure. Carmelo Anthony, Dwight Howard, we're talking about, big time names, but they're not the same as LeBron James in terms of their production. Their production has slowly fallen off over the years, whereas a guy like LeBron, who is 38 as well, and entering his 20th season, is continuing to go strong. So while the Lakers have clearly committed to a younger, more energetic roster, that leaves a lot of question marks for all these unsigned Lakers of the purple and gone, perhaps. Thank you all for watching. Please remember to like this video and subscribe to our channel, Basketball at the Bar. Again, I am Calvin, and I will see you next time.